Okay, so thanks very much for inviting us across. We've got a short presentation, a few slides to go through, a bit of background really in terms of some of the pension issues and particularly around the tax side of things. There's a lot happening at the moment, as you'll hopefully all appreciate, with the McLeod remedy, which really started yesterday. So there'll probably be quite a bit that Rob can talk you through on that one in terms of what the unknowns are that we still are waiting to hear, and also sort of timelines of that sort of thing. But questions, please fire them in and we'll try to answer them as we go through. But for now, I will hand over to Rob to lead us through some of the slides. I think you can share the screen, can't you, Rob?
Fantastic, thank you. So if you bear with me 1 second, we'll bring that up. And I think in the first instance, there we go. In the first instance, it was just really to say a little bit of an introduction to myself. Been in financial services now for 26 years almost. Worked with doctors for quite a considerable number of those, and ultimately been involved in NHS Pensions and the calculations, particularly with regards to forecasting benefits in the past. Thankfully, I don't do that any longer. We've got specific team members that do that, and the tax calculations. In terms of the pension scheme itself, I think in simplicity, the answer is there's nothing quite simple with the NHS pension scheme, and therefore then understandably a lot of complexity in surrounding that. Can you guys see the actual slideshow itself, or are you seeing the PowerPoint as such?
I think we're seeing the PowerPoint and we're having to zoom in. It's quite small.
Let me just see if I can amend that. Now, 1 second. I know how to do it. He says. One second. Let me just reshare different screen.
Yeah.
NHS pensions and financial planning is my strong point. Technology, it's obviously not. Is that any better?
It's the same.
Oh, God. 1 second. Let me just see if I can swap it around here on this.
People can use CTRL and middle sidewalls. So somebody's put in the chat anyway that may help people. A middle mouse button to make it bigger. I think I tried that a minute ago and it struggled.
Let me just see. It really doesn't like doing that. 1 second. I'm going to instead.
Rob, let me bring the slides up, shall I? And then
yeah, that would probably be better.
Then you can do the Chris Whitty Duract. Next slide, please. That's it.
Exactly.
Well, as long as we don't have anybody that looks like a kitten whilst we're doing the projection, that probably be good as well. Fine. There we go. Bear with me. That's fine. So some slight changes since this presentation was crafted. But if you want to flip down over to one page there, Nick. The pensions. So perhaps it's worthwhile just giving you a little bit of a background. And NHS Pensions, in its wisdom with the government, was required to do a review of all public sector pension schemes, and the top and tail of it was that the old 1995 scheme was not affordable to be continued long term. So they had to do something about it. And so in creation of the 2008 pension scheme brought about a newer, more sustainably affordable pension scheme. I think going back to the point when the book and the DVD hit the doormat in my household, because my other half's in the NHS pension scheme, what was clearly evident was that there was not a great deal of detail, albeit the things that I naturally, my eyes gravitated to was you can have this if you stay where you are, and you would have a lump sum and I could take it at 60, as opposed to you could have this smaller income. And by the way, you'll have to retire at 65 as a normal expectation. Understandably, not a lot of people decided to take the government up on their offer, and as most people will do with human nature, I'll stick with what I've got because the new thing is not as good. And in their wisdom, they decided to offer us an exercise called Choice 2, which effectively allowed us to have a second thought about that decision that we'd made, just in case we'd not understood everything in the first time they gave it to us, with less information being published. And naturally, people said, I've decided that the right thing was to stick where it was. Enter stage the 2015 scheme, and this ultimately was a pension scheme designed to be completely sustainable. And having read the review consultation as to why they brought this about, I thought was actually quite a fair scheme, because particularly for GPs where your benefits were accrued on the basis of, well, what were your pensionable earnings in each discrete year? Unlike that effort, there are lots of individuals in the NHS pension scheme, the final salary part of it, who would perhaps develop a career on modest earnings, and towards the tail end of the career, loot for promotion, and therefore then their pension for 20, 30 years in retirement was paid out on a, shall we say, an artificially inflated pensionable income. And so therefore then it spurred a lot of these, in my opinion, spurred a lot of these tax positions that, for example, we look at the lifetime allowance, the annual allowance, the income tax, the capital gains, and the inheritance tax side of things. It's important now to understand the evolution of the pension scheme, the evolution of the tax treatment, which there is more potentially on the table coming forward. And actually, much like you will say to your patients, if you do not monitor your health, how can I be expected to help you manage it? This is exactly the same for you guys. You must keep up-to-date records. You must keep, of course, your finger on the pulse of your pension and your finances, and therefore then you'll be able to better manage it. But let's have a look at these. So the lifetime allowance, if you just click over Nick, please. Lifetime allowance was previously set at a little over £1,073,000. And ultimately, we now know in the spring statement that was disbanded. So the tax position or the liability has been removed in the current tax year, and the legislation is set to be abolished at the commencement of 6th of April next year. However, the £1,073,100 is still important rolling forwards as a figure to keep in mind. However, the way that they establish the value of your pension for the purposes of the lifetime allowance, the capital value, is they would take the income that you would see on your total reward statement and multiply it by a factor of 20 and then add it in tax-free cash. Remember, of course, if you've got separate personal pensions, that must also be added into the equation, but only at the face value as to what you see on your statement. There's no multiplication that you need to apply. But in simplicity, the NHS pension scheme, you basically had a pension of about £46,500, and then you would have hit your head on that ceiling of £1,073,100. Anything excess of that was taxed at 25%. And the interesting thing that a lot of people miss when they look at explaining how the lifetime allowance worked was the value in the pension scheme. There are many members that when the lifetime allowance was the only primary tax issue, ultimately they would be opting out of the pension scheme because they were going to breach the lifetime allowance. In my opinion, the lifetime allowance the methodology of how the revenue take the tax charge and the benefits still thereafter, it was still a scheme with extremely good value compared to if you were to opt out purely because of the lifetime allowance and hand somebody like a financial advisor what was your contributions, you'll have lost out on the employer's contribution previously. You'll have paid income tax and national insurance on what you were previously contributing to a pension, and therefore then accept all of the investment risk and the costs attached with investing it. It was still fabulous value for money. But in short, what they will do is they used to look at the excess over the lifetime allowance, notionally multiply that by a factor of 25%, and then divide the result by a factor, depending on what age you were when you retired, which was effectively the scheme's anticipated longevity of how long you'd be claiming the benefits for. It worked out really good value for money just to breach the lifetime allowance and disregard it to a large degree. And the liability that is payable to HMRC was done on your behalf, so there was no additional paperwork as such that you would have to produce, albeit people like myself and Nick would have to do some number crunching if we were going to do some projections. But you can look at your exposure to that position predominantly by looking at your total reward statement still, even though the lifetime allowance has been removed, because there are issues about what is the maximum tax-free cash that you can now access. And that's where the £1,073,100 still is important, because even though there is no lifetime allowance tax charge, if you decide to elect for a higher than standard or any kind of increased lump sum that takes you above 25% of 1,073,100 works out to be about 268,000. Then there are still issues which you need to incorporate within your plans. Do you want to nip over to the next slide, Nick? So previously we had an array of different types of pension protections. Predominantly these would depend as to whether or not I would see individuals with them dependent on their age. You tend to find that most people who will have elected for primary and enhanced protection, I say the vast majority, not all, but vast majority will have retired by now or elected for one or both of those on the basis of they anticipated earning significant sums in their future, and therefore then there was no disadvantage to electing for them. Fixed protection can be lost, particularly if individuals have continued to make pension contributions, which kind of gravitates towards the more flexible protections, so individual protection 14 and its little brother, individual protection 2016. There was no negative implications of electing for those. It just meant then that a notional value was effectively monitored against your pension if you decide to make further contributions. But ultimately, they were designed that whilst the lifetime allowance in its reductions on a periodical basis, you effectively created a watermark, a tide mark, shall we say, of a higher personalised lifetime allowance. And again, some of those protections, whilst it might initially feel as though, well, they've been superseded by the removal or the abolishment of the lifetime allowance, actually are still quite important, particularly surrounding tax-free cash, reinforcing the need to review your position and to consider, of course, the benefit of maintaining those. One of the important things is that, as I said earlier on, the removal of the lifetime allowance, not the abolishment just yet, is quite important, that when you come to claim your pension benefits, although NHS Pensions, I understand, have access to HMRC to understand what protection you may well actually have, they'll still ask you for it and the reference number of your certificate anyway. So it's important to have that reference number and certificate to hand when you claim your AW8 or your AW8P, which is the form you fill in when you look to make your benefit claim, to slide that in there and of course incorporate the reference details in on your claim form. Where protection may well be lost, again, for example, if you've elected previously for fixed protection, but then continued to make pension contributions, it's important to notify HMRC as soon as possible, traditionally within 90 days of the loss of that protection. And I appreciate that you may not have established whether or not the protection's been lost. First thing to do is to come back to somebody like Nick, who can effectively then ask one of the team members to review that position for you. It's important because the penalties can be quite significant if you fail to notify HMRC in the timescales. Do you want to flick over, Nick? So, as I mentioned, as the lifetime allowance protections have now been removed, with it scheduled to be abolished next year, again, as I said earlier on, it's important to understand what it is you may well still have as a protection, particularly for tax-free cash. So first thing to do, make contact with Nick in the first instance. Do you want to slide over, Nick? Now, some of the other things which, of course, can be of interest. I mentioned to you early on about taking a higher level of tax-free cash. In the pension world, it's called commutation. In the simple world that I work in, giving up income in exchange for tax-free lump sum. The commutation factor is really of interest, and just aside from the lifetime allowance, the commutation factor is £12 for £1. What that basically means is, for every pound of income you give up, you can access £12 of tax-free cash. Now, if you were a fireman or policeman, the tax-free cash element, the commutation rate, is higher. Anything as high as perhaps even 24 times or £24 of tax-free cash for every pound of income. That's not to say that you picked the wrong occupation in life. However, they do have enhancements in excess of NHS pension members. Traditionally speaking, in the financial services, giving up income for extra tax-free cash is not particularly seen as good value for money for NHS pension members. It is important to remember, however, your personal circumstances, which may well be either debt to pay off at retirement that I've not been able to do throughout my working life, and therefore I need the extra tax-free cash. It's also important to consider issues which are personal, such as your personal health and that perhaps of your spouse. Also good reasons why it might be feasible to give up income. The interesting thing is when you do commute for extra tax-free cash, God forbid you were to die prematurely, it does not negatively affect your widow's or widower's pension entitlement. So it is important as a feature to consider a little bit more. Naturally, of course, before any lifetime allowance previously was calculated, they would reduce your pension by any previously elected scheme pays, which in effect was if you incurred an annual allowance tax charge, instead of having to pay that cash through your tax return, you asked the pension scheme to pay it. The order of calculation was they reduced it for the annual allowance scheme pays before establishing the lifetime allowance reduction. In terms of that, there are a number of other options that you can look to utilise. Again, in order to be able to establish an enhancement to your tax-free cash, particularly with all the pension flexibilities now that the NHS pension scheme is going to put in play. Effectively, as you could draw early, you could defer your membership to a later date, you could reduce your earnings. All of those were little tactics that you could employ in order to be able to reduce your tax exposure. Do you want to flick over now? So coming on to the annual allowance, which is obviously still the aspect which is at most people's forefront of the minds. In the spring statement, Jeremy Hunt, who previously was zero, but perhaps turned into hero overnight with NHS individuals, ultimately increased the annual allowance from £40,000 to £60,000, and the tapered annual allowance, which was the event which got most medics banging on the door at Whitehall, was the tapering of the annual allowance from £4,000 increased to £10,000. Not a particularly large sum of money. However, his increase of the annual allowance from 40 to 60k meant that the tapered thresholds increased from £240,000 to £260,000. His statement said that most medics would be removed from the tapering procedure albeit there are always going to be some individuals, depending on whether or not you've got a very high earning practice and or additional earnings, which are not necessarily NHS pensionable, rental income, private clinic work, still possible for certain individuals to exceed £260,000. But the top and tail of it was, if you think about the annual allowance as I always imagine this as a football goal post. In essence, the tapering reduces the height of the crossbar, and therefore then if you kick the ball over that, it's the excess over the crossbar that was subject to a tax charge, and the tax charge on the excessive contributions was effectively taxed at your same marginal rate of tax as the rest of your earned income. And the way that they did that was they looked at the goalpost analogies. The left-hand goalpost was the start of the pension year, now the tax year. The right-hand goalpost was the end of the tax year. And effectively, they wanted to measure the distance between the two posts. They would do that by saying, well, effectively, what was the increase in value? And then we'll multiply that by a factor of 16 and add the lump sum. And that determines whether or not you're going to kick the ball over the goalpost. Now, I'll give you a little example. So at the start of the pension year, Dr. Smith had a pension statement, total reward statement, that said his 1995 rights were worth £50,000. And after his year of contributions between employers and employees' contribution rates, the right hand the goalpost said total reward statement confirmed pension of £53,000 and tax-free lump sum of £159,000. So you'd have had a £3,000 increase in the income, £9,000 increase in the lump sum. They multiplied the £3,000 by 16 and added the 9,000. So it would give Dr. Smith £59,000 of taxable growth on his benefits. But if he only had an allowance previously 40, he'd have an excess that we'd have to pay tax on. Now they've pumped up the crossbar to 60k. It should, in most instances, cut out an annual allowance tax problem. Where you do have an annual allowance tax problem, of course, you can either pay it yourself through your tax return, or alternatively still utilise the scheme pays election, which in essence, you turn over net. In essence, you've got a cut-off date in which to make that election by. Either if you don't make a scheme pays election, it has to be paid in your tax return. So therefore then the 31st of July and 31st of January, your payment dates as normal. And also there is a extra window. If you just nip over in a second, Nick. There we go. There's an extra window, of course, which was the 31st of July following the end of the period in which the tax bill was due, but it's considered as a loan by NHS Pensions, and loans, of course, therefore bear interest, and ultimately the interest rate is compounded at CPI inflation, which is the inflationary measure your pensions, of course, increase by, but plus a premium of 2.4%. Now, traditionally, in a very generic terms, scheme pays elections should be very, very carefully considered, because if you are young enough and they are large enough, they can have quite a profound effect on your end of career entitlement. What I would suggest, however, though, is that it's important to look at that on a rolling basis. It's important to understand, of course, that your pensionable benefits are going to be predominantly what affords you the retirement that you're looking for when you get there. Now, I think in summary, what a lot of doctors, again, working with medics over the time period that have done, very, very busy people, and coming home late at night after you've done all of your surgery work and then looked at your pathology reports and the like, pulling the box file out from underneath your bed and going through your personal finances in minutiae is not something I've met most doctors want to do or even try. But in simplicity, if what we're trying to do is establish, is scheme pays the right thing for me? Well, we've got to take it away from that perspective and actually look at your earnings after income tax, compare that against your spending habits. And we can look at projecting those spending habits pre and post retirement if as a financial planner, we can understand what's the debt position of the household. So i.e. your residential mortgage, car loans. What about things like your children? When do they anticipate going to university or private school? Because those are all costs that are needed to be taken into account. Because ultimately, if you've not got the surplus net income to actually pay the annual allowance tax charges, it's almost a non-starting conversation anyway. Or could you cut personal spending and constrict that to the point whereas you could pay some of the annual allowance bill or all of it? Because remember, a scheme pays election doesn't have to be an all or nothing situation. What we're trying to do is avoid crippling potentially your at retirement income. In terms of that, though, if you want to flick over, Nick, what we have got is a number of different issues to consider. In effect, what you will do is at the beginning of the pension year is look to forecast what you anticipate your next year's worth of pensionable earnings are going to be. Only once, of course, PCSE have taken those contributions throughout the year, only after the actual pension year has been completed, people like Nick will then have the relevant information to actually establish what your pensionable earnings would be. Now, it's important for you to understand that retrospective position Nick is in, because ultimately you've paid your contributions throughout the year on a forecast, nothing more. Once the details are understood, Nick will then actually provide you with a pensionable earnings certificate, which is then passed on to PCSE, which I'm sure you've all had dealings with in some way, shape or form in the past. And we know that that body is not, shall we say, as the pencil is not as sharp as it should be and sharpened in as a timely fashion as it should be. NHS Business Services Authority, the people who actually provide your total reward statement and your pension savings statements, your annual allowance figures, have to work on information provided by PCSE, which, if they have received your information and it goes in the pile, I myself have come across people who have had 4 and 5 years worth of information that is not being updated, and therefore they may well not receive a PSS, an annual allowance statement from NHS Pensions, and even if they do, could be based on an anticipated figure and therefore not accurate. In most instances, it just won't produce one. So it's important to ensure that you guys are on top of your finances, because what has happened in the past is people get to retire, stereotypically give the 3 months notice that the partnership requires in order to be able to retire. And that's where the problems begin, because NHS Pensions have not got the information required from PCSE in a timely fashion to make payment. So we have to keep on top of them. And they have brought out digital systems which are designed to ensure the information processing is a lot better, but it will never, ever be you having ultimate control over your information. Copies of your certificates, checking your total reward statement on an annual basis to make sure it's being updated. If it's not being updated, reaching out to people like myself and Nick to try and get PCSE to force the update, or making sure your practice manager has digital access, making sure it's being updated accordingly there. There are other issues, of course, with annual allowance tax charges. Naturally, which we'll get to in just 1 second, the McLeod situation is something which needs to be considered, because ultimately it's going to roll back your benefits into the old legacy pension scheme, which inevitably is going to add a period of time that there's going to be some opacity. Is this information correct? Have they rolled it back, or is it still based on the non-rollback data? I think in terms of the actual pension scheme itself, it's important to understand, without going through every particular bullet point on this, it's important to establish that your details are up to date. That's the key message that I can give you. You want to roll forward, Nick? So one of the things which, excuse me, one of the things which is still being questioned, of course, particularly for high earning individuals, is how to try and minimize the likelihood of being hit with an annual allowance tax charge. Well, think of this as a kid in a candy shop. Whilst the pension flexibilities have been brought about to try and retain and promote further recruitment within the NHS service, what they've effectively done is they've spoilt you with choice, because the pension flexibilities are going to bring about more options, which ultimately means more complexity. Now, the one thing that I would say as a financial planner, and again, it's only through experience this, is that if we try to calculate and forecast all of the options, I will guarantee it in a candy shop. You'll be spoilt for choice and won't understand which one is perhaps best for you. The easiest thing, which I, again, through experience have found, is to sit down with a doctor and discuss what it is they want to see for their future. Because instead of producing perhaps 15 or 20 different calculations and forecast outputs, one of which would be terribly expensive for you to actually envisage, actually try and funnel that process down as to, well, if we understand what it is that you want your future to look like, 17 out of the 20 options available to you are actually irrelevant anyway. So let's look at having a focused view and funnel that down as much as possible so that the options we do put in front of you to consider, well, actually, that's a lot better. Of which some of the options may well naturally just fly under the radar for annual allowance and the old lifetime allowance, particularly with the tax-free cash enhancement. But I think the important thing is not to let the tax tail wag the lifestyle dog that you're looking to lead. I'll flick over now. So coming on to McLeod, top and tail of this is the firefighters and the judges took the government to court on the grounds of discrimination. And I do laugh because, of course, it was the judges who were going to rule in this, and they were hardly going to rule against their own own court case. But interestingly, the government, I personally felt that they had actually thought about this quite well. But in the thought process, they lost the case on the grounds of age discrimination. It was not fair that doctors or NHS pension scheme members closer to the retirement age of their legacy scheme circumnavigated any change. And so therefore then the government held their hands up and said, well, for all of the public sector pension schemes, we'll roll over and we'll just abide by the latest court ruling. In essence, what it meant was everybody in the pension scheme, as of the 1st of April 2022, were going to be in the reformed 2015 scheme. But for those members who were young enough that spent some time in the 2015 scheme between the years of 2015 and 2022, they would have those options benefits to be rolled back into their old legacy schemes. The key thing is for the purpose of calculation, they'll be automatically rolled back, but that does not necessarily mean that the individual will elect for that when they come to take the benefits. And the critical thing here is to remember this, is the NHS pension scheme or the NHS BSA are going to undertake an enormous amount of calculations. This is not just for people who have not yet collected their benefits. It will be for members who are actively paying in, members who have deferred their membership, opted out, and for members in receipt of benefits, approximately 3 million individuals. So you can imagine these calculations are going to take quite some time. Okay, do not panic if your McLeod offering does not hit your doormat, given that they said they were going to start the rollout of offerings yesterday. Do not panic if it doesn't hit your doormat by this weekend. Okay, but what I will say is that when the numbers come out, here's the real critical thing to remember. The question yet will be, does this calculation reflect what like they were doing back in 2011, when they offered me the book and the DVD, revert back. Does it reflect what I will see in my total reward statement, where added years contracts, scheme pays elections that I've previously had, will they all be visible in there? Well, at the moment, we don't know. We just don't know. But the important thing is, however, pick up the telephone, speak with myself, speak with Nick, whoever your contact is at Moore Smalley, or if not, if you're using a standard financial advisor or a standard accountant, they may not understand the NHS pension scheme and the implications intimately enough in order to be able to give you advice and guidance in this. Ask us, because ultimately it may well be that even though the government has given you some numbers, they may not be bespoke to your individual history. And that's the critical thing. Everything here is a bit like when you write a script out. Penicillin may not work for every single patient that you prescribe it to. It's the same thing. So have a look at the statement. If there are questions, pick up the telephone and speak to a specialist. So just to give you an idea of the difference in benefits, what I've done here is just provided some very, very quick and dirty calculations. You can see here is you have what we call a dynamised pot. In very simple terms, that is a breakdown of your pensionable earnings history, inflated by inflation to arrive at a value which NHS Pensions then multiply by a percentage to work out what they're going to pay you in very, very simple terms. So we've got a £3.5 million dynamised pot for a member of the 1995 and the same for a 2015 member. You can see, of course, that going back to the book and the DVD, well, actually, I've got a lower income, but I do have a tax-free lump sum, whereas I have a higher income with the 2015 scheme, no automatic tax-free lump sum. The 2015 scheme, however, though, is a normal retirement age of the state pension age. So I've used effectively a figure here of 67. And therefore, then, if a member wanted to retire at 60, comparatively, it would bring their pension down to £44,500. Now, the reason why they do that is they're going to be paying you for 7 years longer. So therefore, they need to reduce that down in order to be able to make it mathematically the same as the 1995 rights. If an individual wanted tax-free cash, they commute a pound of cash for £12 of tax-free cash to get the 147,000 again, means that their commuted income drops down to 32,500. You can see there what whilst one might assume from this example that the 2015 scheme is clearly not as good, what you must remember is that a 2015 scheme, the accrual rate, so the growth rate is better each year than it was in the 1995 scheme. So in reality, if you started off your career in the 1995 scheme and you did 30 years, or 40 years is the general maximum, as opposed to 40 years in the 2015 scheme, the actual figure may well grow faster. So by end of career, it could be bigger than the comparative 3.5 million. Critical thing, everybody's circumstances will be different. Do you want to flip over it? So the tax implications, the lower accrual rate in the 1995 or 2008 scheme, less likely to expose you to an annual allowance tax charge, but again, important to have a look at personally on your individual circumstances, because if you've had a history of a good earning practice or you've had spikes in the year in terms of income, then of course that can cause annual allowance tax problems even in the legacy schemes. The other critical thing is the old legacy scheme, there were some events which traditionally triggered an annual allowance exposure. As I say, high earnings is one of them. The second thing was a low level of inflation or a sudden drop in inflation. Now, given that in the recent past, we've seen inflation as high as 11.1%, recently dropping down now to 6.7%, that could be an event which triggers a significant amount of growth in the old 1995 and 2008 pension schemes. So just bear in mind, if you are an individual who's also paying into personal pensions as well as your NHS, you might want to have a look at doing that very, very carefully in case you end up with a tax bill because of such action. The important thing is, of course, is that if you do end up with an annual allowance bill, yes, you've got the option of a scheme pays election, but understand it can impact significantly on your end of a career. And the interesting thing is, of course, is for the reversion back to the old 1995 scheme, where there are, of course, time limits that you might well be due some money back from HMRC. Chance would be a fine thing, but it's always a nice dream to have. There's no limitation on the clawback period, I understand from Nick, whereas ordinarily there may well be. And just flip over now. So, as I mentioned earlier on, members who have already drawn the benefits, well, they'll still be offered the McLeod ruling rollback. In terms of payments on pension contributions, this is an interesting one because ultimately there will be individuals who decided to opt out of the pension scheme because of the tax position. Interestingly enough, whilst ordinarily you would not be able to make retrospective contributions for previous years worth of opted out membership, in this circumstance you will be allowed to do that. However, given that you would have to pay employers and employees rates potentially, those contributions could be quite significant. So it's important to understand if you've got a practice with a large amount of cash held on your in your capital account, that might be something that you would like to have a look at doing. It's important to understand the tax implications and cost implications. Again, you would get that if you had a specialist advisor that you can do the calculations. The other thing is, of course, if you decided to avoid the loss of enhanced protection, again, it may well be something that you need to have a look at calculating very carefully as to whether or not enhanced protection is worth losing. Whether or not the last bullet point, the interesting thing is whether or not the huge amount of calculations that would go into this will be done by NHS Business Services Authority. I doubt severely they will do those for you on an automated basis. They will be looking at doing the minimal required in order to be able to provide you what they are required to do so. One of the features that we do have as an ASMA specialist, which is the Association of Independent Specialist Medical Accountants, we do have quite an experienced and skilled team in the calculations. As I say, I used to do these many years ago, but fortunately don't have to do them any longer. Male pattern baldness was a result of having to do these calculations personally. We do have a great team that can do those for you and bespoke the different scenarios that you're looking for. Flip over now. That was kind of the lead on then to for you there, Nick. But ultimately, you need to have a think about the tax positions quite carefully. That's me. That's me done. Any questions?
Great, thank you, Rob. Thank you, Nick. I think there's a couple of questions in the chat. I think Khalid, Dr. Butter's come back saying if you are at or above your lifetime allowance, this is implication of annual allowance to be taxed on overall uplift of your pot. Is this right?
So if you are at or above the lifetime allowance,
I just explained that. You know,
Yeah.
a lot of the sort of colleagues have been hit by the fact that they think they're not putting that much extra into pension per year annual allowance, but then they get hit by, because of the pension pot's quite big, it's uplifting the pension pot as well as what you're putting into the allowance, annual pension that's taxable.
It is. So ultimately, I used to use the old Mexican wave, or the and this is my non-medical mindset, but I believe cardiac muscle works in like a wave-like motion. Well, very similar. If you think about your historic benefits, the indexation of how they maintain your benefits, the value of it with inflation, works like a wave-like motion. But every year that you add a year's worth of pensionable contributions builds on the starting point, which naturally increases the end point. It's a linear set of calculations. You're absolutely right that the more tenured you are, traditionally speaking, particularly for the final salary schemes, it absolutely compromised the annual allowance position. The design of the care scheme, the new 2015 scheme, doesn't entirely remove that compounding problem because it still has the indexation. But the benefits that you're calculated on are what you earn discretely in each respective year. That shouldn't dissuade anybody looking at what would it be as if I moved my 2015 to 22 entitlement back into the old legacy scheme, though. But you're right there, Khalid.
Great, thank you. Somebody's just put in the chat, Debbie Swain at Lombard Medical Centre. What about drawdowns now? Do you want to expand on that at all, Debbie?
I think probably Nick will understand. We can start, the scheme's changed slightly now, hasn't it? Where you can start taking drawdowns rather than having to wait for a certain time and like stay in the 2015 and that, more probably for employees than doctors. But I don't know if it was the same for doctors, that they can take drawdowns.
Yeah, it's the same for everyone. I think the fundamental difference will be for GPs, predominantly the partners, is that they'll obviously have to agree within the partnership that the reduction in their working patterns and the claim of some of their pension benefits, whether that's feasible for the practice itself. But in simplicity, you have the ability now to draw down on your pension in within 10% tranches. So ultimately, what a member could do is claim some of their pension and either carry on working their standard hours, or alternatively claim some of the pension in order to try and phase down to retirement, and so that they don't fall off a cliff with their take-home pay. Traditionally, again, it's only through experience. Many of my doctors will effectively, let's say they've got an ambition of retiring at 60. You will traditionally find within the last 3 to 5 years, they start to step down their earnings. Now, that's perhaps to ensure that the practice continues to thrive after their departure, whether it's because they have a very little time flexibility, during the working careers to actually focus on hobbies and develop their interests. And therefore, then it allows them that reclamation of personal time with still having some balance of earnings to develop interests and hobbies. And I think the other thing is, of course, is ultimately, just patient contact to make sure that people that they've got on their, shall we say, their patient list who are taken care of, they don't just walk away and leave them. So that kind of phasing down is something that we've had in obviously the private sector for many, many years. It's just now being brought about to NHS personnel. Its design was really to try and keep hold of you all for a little bit longer, because there obviously are major recruitment problems in the NHS. Will it or won't it? The jury's out, let's say. Yeah, retire at 60. That is young.
Excellent, thank you.
I think practice managers are in a similar position, really, because you kind of, work your butts off, and then to just cut off straight away. I think it's quite an option now for practice managers who are on this meeting as well, to maybe draw down and phase out a little bit.
Yeah, and very similar, it kind of goes back to particularly for practice managers. There are two things that I just mentioned there. Perhaps a job share option to allow for that blending in of somebody, who's going to pick up the baton. The other thing just to remember, and it's not in this slide pack, is something called the final pay control charge. And that's where you've got a non-clinical partner, traditionally the practice manager. It's important there just to keep an eye on your earnings, particularly post-COVID. If they spike and then come back down again, traditionally, because you're not working on the same basis of as the GPs do, you're potentially still working on the final salary for the old 1995 or 2008 schemes. It's important to understand that there can be a hefty old charge placed against you there if your earnings drop having spiked, and then you try and retire. So just a point to pick up the telephone and talk to us on that if you're in that boat.
Great, thank you, Rob. Another question in the chat is, where can practice employed staff get pension advice and guidance?
Well, I would always say pick up the telephone to NHS Business Services Authority in the first instance. You know, as stretched a resource as they are, they do have some really good, easy answers, because I think in the first instance, they're just the easy go-to point and it costs nothing. They will stop at guidance and not step into the world of advice, but they're really quite good at telling you, you know, where the barrier lies. I think when it comes to finances, it doesn't matter whether you're a doctor, a nurse, a healthcare, it doesn't really matter what your role is within the practice. It's important, first of all, as a financial planner, to step back to the points that I said earlier on, and list down direct debits, list down non-direct debit spending, get copies of statements, have a look at where your pension statement, your basic state pension's up to. That's a dead easy access point you can access through Google, because it's important that you don't just step into retirement without any kind of foresight as to whether or not you're going to be able to afford it. So have a look at the basics, and what we can do through yourself, Stuart, is send you some templates that will at least help you collate data. And you may well then be able to say, well, actually, my affairs are really quite simple and straightforward. I've got the statements. I understand my spending. Actually, I can move forward. Where there are additional complications, then absolutely, you know, we can step in and help. And we'll always be upfront and transparent about costs and services and values added.
That's really useful. I'm in receipt of my military pension, and it was a nightmare when I left the military to try and understand this is a minefield and commutation and inverted commutation, and you know, then the McLaren thing came out, so I'm now having letters and having to think about that. So it's a bit of a
Well, just one point on advice sources. It is very important, this. There's always been a little bit of joviality in my clients' banks between doctors and dentists. And doctors, of course, GPs traditionally get remunerated on patient size list. And so it's important that from medical practice, the way that I see it is there's a, shall we say, a divorce between acting on a patient's behalf and the remuneration. Dentists, the joke there being is, drill and fill as many as you possibly can, and you'll use up your daily units of daily activity, and that's how you're remunerated. Because if you don't use them all up, when they come to renegotiate your contract, they'll pull some of that money back off you. Now, the interesting thing is the independence of that service that you get from a GP. The same applies for financial services. The independence of the solutions that you may well get is key. And in financial services, there are two types of advisor today: independent financial advisors, who have no truckings, no bias with the solutions or strategies or investments or insurances that you receive. The other is a restricted advisor, whereas the analogy that I use is if all you've got is a hammer in your bag, the whole world is a nail. And that's really quite important when you look at certain providers as to what they will actually recommend. It's important to understand, well, what else could they recommend? Or is that the only thing that they can recommend? And that's why you're getting it.
Seems like it's an Analogy Monday.
It is analogy. Full of cliches, I am.
Love it, Rob, love it. Are there any more questions at all from the group? For Nick or for Rob? No. Okay, so I'll put your contact details. I hope that was okay. I'll put those in the chat as well for colleagues who are attending today. So it'd be really useful to, you know, to share maybe some of the slides, or you mentioned about template letters. That'll be really useful going forward. And also we'll share the recording as well in our newsletter to practices across the whole of Nottinghamshire this week. But last call for questions then. Why you have the specialists here? Ask away.
There's usually an element of shyness at this stage, I must admit.
There is. It's normally me.
You can always, if they've got a personal question, you can always email or contact Nick or myself anyway, offline.
Perfect. Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Nick. Thank you very much, Rob, for attending today. Lovely to see you both. Hopefully we'll try and get you come in, maybe in the next couple of months or so again. That'd be really useful. And maybe we'll have a bit more update about the McLeod situation in particular, and the end of the financial year as well. So thank you very much. For those who are still in the chat now, next week we'll be joined by Will Sutton from the Associate Team Leader Urgent Care Services on Monday. So until then, have a lovely week, stay safe, and thank you for joining today. Thank you. Thanks, Nick. Thank you, Rob.
Thanks, Dan. My pleasure.
Bye-bye.